Welcome everyone, and this evening we're having a look at the Queen of Crime, Agatha Christie, with her fabulous novel Death on the Nile. So let me take you to Egypt, to Inspector Hercule Poirot, or rather Detective Hercule Poirot, and lots of corpses on a boat on the Nile. I'd like to begin with a reading from the end of the novel. If you haven't read it, I'm afraid this is going to be a spoiler, but I'm sort of assuming that everyone has read it or seen a movie version. And this is Poirot explaining at the end of the novel. The two halves of the murder. What gave Simon his alibi? The shot fired by Jacqueline. What gave Jacqueline her alibi? The insistence of Simon, which resulted in a hospital nurse remaining with her all night. There, between the two of them, you get all the qualities you require. The cool, resourceful, planning brain, Jacqueline de Belfort's brain, and the man of action to carry it out with incredible swiftness and timing. Look at it the right way, and it answers every question. Simon Doyle and Jacqueline had been lovers. Realize that they are still lovers, and it is all clear. Simon does away with his rich wife, inherits her money, and in due course will marry his old love. It was all very ingenious. The persecution of Madame Doyle by Jacqueline, all part of the plan. Simon's pretended rage, and yet there were lapses. He held forth to me once about possessive women, held forth with real bitterness. It ought to have been clear to me that it was not his wife he was thinking about, not Jacqueline. That it was his wife he was thinking about, not Jacqueline. Then his manner to his wife in public. An ordinary, inarticulate Englishman such as Simon Doyle is very embarrassed at showing any affection. Simon was not a really good actor. He overdid the devoted manner. That conversation I had with Mademoiselle Jacqueline, too, when she pretended that somebody had overheard. I saw no one, and there was no one. But it was to be a useful red herring later. Then one night on this boat, I thought I heard Simon and Lynette outside my cabin. He was saying, "We've got to go through with it now." It was Doyle, all right, but it was to Jacqueline that he was speaking. The final drama was perfectly planned and timed. But of course, Hercule Poirot works out who did it on the Nile, and he knows that the pretended shooting of Simon Doyle was not an actual shooting, and this gives him the chance to feign an injury and commit a murder. And he knows that Simon Doyle, as he says, is not a very good actor. So Death on the Nile is a fabulous Agatha Christie novel. And Agatha Christie herself was a truly amazing phenomenon. She took a fairly simple form of entertainment that was moderately popular at the time she began to write, and through it she made herself into a name from China to Africa. And of course, Poirot and Agatha Christie have been put onto postage stamps in many countries around the world. And in the course of this, she sold vast numbers of her books. She was translated into 103 languages, which is actually quite a lot more than Shakespeare has been translated into. She wrote a record-breaking play, and she made the name Agatha Christie a sort of worldwide shorthand for mystery novels. She became the first lady of crime. I think Agatha Christie knew what she could do well, and she did it superbly. I don't think she is a great stylist. I don't think she creates many in-depth characters, but she is a master at working out a puzzle and a plot and bringing it all together in a dramatic conclusion. I think that her books appeal to us for various reasons. They satisfy our desire for hunting down somebody who has done something wrong and catching them in the end. They show us that justice will prevail over evil. In a world that is increasingly irrational, they quietly defend rationality, order, and method. They appeal to our sense of mystery, but in the end, they solve that mystery, so we know who done it. I don't think that any other writer in the genre gives us so often that amazing click of satisfaction at the end, when all those suspects are gathered together in a room, or in the case of Death on the Nile, on a boat, and Poirot says, well, you could have done it because of this reason, you could have done it because of that reason and this method, but actually you are the one that did it. So there's this amazing sense of satisfaction, order being restored, and all the loose ends fall very neatly into place at the end of the novel. It was no coincidence that Agatha Christie's 80th title was published on her 80th birthday. She was a woman who loved numbers, she had a great sense of order, and I think that fact that the 80th novel was published on the 80th birthday tells us quite a lot about the woman behind these extraordinary novels. Now, she wrote generally about people who are ordinary, whose qualities we share and can understand. And even Poirot is exactly what the English think a foreigner ought to be. A little bit of a dandy, a little bit fussy, odd habits, strange mannerisms. But of course, Poirot in the end manages to solve the crime. And Agatha Christie, I think, really stuck to what she knew. And this made her a very direct and a very efficient storyteller. She never tried to be particularly clever or avant-garde in her writing. She just wanted to be very ingenious in her plots. So she's a master of technique rather than of style. She doesn't arouse any great personal interest in most of her characters. If a greedy maid is strangled in the course of the story, nobody really sheds a tear over it as they read the novel. The few characters that we get emotionally involved with are the major characters such as Poirot or Miss Marple. Most of the other characters are there almost as stage props, and we don't sort of feel any great sense of loss or emotional involvement over what they're going through. Many of her characters are stock characters. The greedy maid, the absent-minded parson, the rather dithery colonel who's not quite sure what he's doing, the eccentric writer of novels. So she uses these sort of stock cardboard characters as a part of her plot. And I don't think we read her novels for any sort of study in psychology. And there's no great passion in her novels. And we ourselves as readers are not deeply emotionally involved in the stories. They're not people we particularly care for, but we are fascinated by the plot and the working out of the mystery. So really, in her books, what matters is the puzzle. Now, throughout much of the book, we share Poirot's perception of what is going on, and we follow the story with some clarity. But then it becomes evident to us that Poirot has been able to deduce something that has left us as the reader behind. Somewhere along the line, he outstrips us and we are lost. There are some people who read the novels incredibly carefully and try to work out in advance who actually did the crime. Personally, I prefer just to go through with the story and enjoy it, and then have that wonderful sense of surprise at the end when Poirot gathers those suspects together and tells us who did it. So we get a bit of a puzzle from Poirot's activity right before he tends to reveal who did the crime, because he's lost us somewhere along the way. We're not working out what it is that he's doing and why he's conducting strange tests or interviews or whatever it might be. And then at the end of the novel, the puppet characters are put away and Poirot moves on to solve another crime. So let's have a look at this truly amazing woman, Agatha Christie, who produced so many books that have made her phenomenally popular, not just a bit popular, but phenomenally popular around the world. Well, her full name was Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller. She was born on the 15th of September in Torquay in the year 1890. She began her autobiography by saying that one of the luckiest things that happened to her in life was having a happy childhood. And here you can see her with her mother. Her mother was Clara Boehmer and her father, Frederick Alva Miller. He was actually an American. And the couple settled at Ashfield House in Torquay, just sort of on the outskirts of Torquay. And it was there that Agatha grew up in a happy, secure and very contented environment. There's Torquay today. Now, she was the youngest of 3 children in the family, and she was the youngest by several years. So as Agatha was growing up, her older siblings, her sister and her brother, ended up leaving home. So in many ways, she was like an only child. And she either played with other adults or she played on her own. She always felt that servants were the most exciting and interesting part of everyday life. And of course, servants tend to play a very big part in her novels, especially those set in English country houses. She had pets and lots of imaginary playmates, and most of what went on in her childhood life was really going on inside her head. She would speak aloud to her imaginary friends. And later, when she came to write her novels, she would speak aloud the dialogue for the characters in her books. With real people, she was actually extremely shy and inarticulate. So her older brother and sister went off to boarding school. Round about the time that Agatha was born, her mother had decided that boarding school was not the ideal for children, and she thought that it would be best if her youngest daughter was educated at home. So Agatha's education was a very informal one in many ways, and she herself would always see this as an advantage. She felt it was a plus that she had not been sent away to school. And there are various places around Torquay today that are associated with her years of growing up. She adored arithmetic, and I think her interest in numbers tends to come through in her fiction. She took dancing lessons, she travelled frequently to France, and she became a very, very talented piano player. Arithmetic was her favourite subject. She later always loathed the stress that she felt modern women had to contend with. Now, she grew up in a home where neither of her parents worked. There were loads of servants to make sure that the house ran smoothly. There were no sort of responsibilities of running an estate. It was in many ways a very privileged and a very easy childhood. And here you can see a bust of Agatha Christie in Torquay, a hotel where she sets her novel Peril at End House, and down at the bottom there, a place where she often went to dances as a young girl. This was the home, Ashfield House, in which Agatha Christie grew up. Now, when Agatha Christie was 11 years old, her father died. His financial affairs had suddenly been getting worse, and he was actually taking the very drastic step of going out to find a job when he caught double pneumonia, and he ended up dying from that. Her brother was out in India with his regiment. Her sister had married and had a home of her own. So Agatha was left in this rather large house with her mother. Now, her mother's health was very poor, and she suffered from very severe asthma attacks. And at night, young Agatha, only a little girl, not yet even in her teens, had to stand outside her mother's door and listen to hear if her mother was still breathing. So this must have been a rather insecure part of her childhood. The standard of the servants dropped, meals were no longer quite what they had been. So suddenly the lack of decent money meant that the lifestyle that Agatha had become accustomed to had to change. But of course, much of this would appear in her fiction when she writes about servants and life in country houses where people live very comfortably. Now, in her mid-teens, Agatha went off to a day school 2 days a week and realised that had she ever had any sort of formal education, she probably would have become a mathematician. At the age of 15, she went off on her own to a pensionnat in Paris and that's where this photograph of her was taken. And she was sent off to a finishing school where she could study singing and piano. She was a wonderful pianist and could probably have become a concert performer. However, she was so shy that the thought of playing the piano in front of an audience absolutely terrified her. She was tall, pretty, had grey eyes and red hair and a fair complexion. And as time went on, she did become rather solid in her figure. She loved her food, and we do get wonderful details of food in her novels. She never drank alcohol, but her favourite drink was a glass of undiluted cream. So it's not really surprising that she did put on some weight in the course of her life. So by the middle of her life, she was a much more substantial figure. Now, of course, her expected career was going out into society and finding a husband. She actually ended up doing her coming out in Egypt because she and her mother went off to visit her brother, who was there with his regiment. And here you can see various places associated with Agatha in Torquay. She became a very keen swimmer, and on one occasion in the water in Tor Bay, she nearly drowned. Another experience, I think, that brought death to the forefront of her mind. So then it was off to Cairo. Her mother needed to convalesce, and it was recommended that she go off to Egypt for her health. And really it was in Egypt that Agatha did her sort of formal coming out. She went to balls and to polo matches and to picnics, and she found it very easy to fit into what was expected of young ladies of her generation. The author Vera Brittain would later write of the experience of coming out in Britain and the sorts of clothes that young girls were expected to wear. I am seized with angry resentment against the conventions which wrapped up my comely adolescent body in woolen combinations, black cashmere stockings, liberty bodice, dark stockinette knickers, flannelette petticoat, and often, in addition, a long-sleeved, high-necked, knitted woolen spencer. Well, I'm sure in Egypt, Agatha didn't need to wear quite so many layers of clothes, but still, it was a very sort of prescribed experience, this whole coming out for young ladies. And there you can see Agatha in Egypt, a country where, of course, she would return when it came to settings of her novels. So this first experience of Egypt would give her material that would go into Death on the Nile. Now, she received several marriage proposals, but she ended up returning to England and more parties, the sorts of house parties that are very frequently described in her books, where a miscellaneous collection of people are gathered together, and there are often frustrations, resentments, greeds, and of course, in her novels, always at least one corpse somewhere in the course of the story. Now, she ended up becoming engaged to an army officer. But while she was waiting for this young man to be posted home, she met a man called Hercule Christie. He was an army man, he was handsome, he was brave. In many ways, he was very unlike Agatha. And Agatha's mother did not approve of Archie at all, but Agatha thought he was absolutely gorgeous. He arrived in her life zooming in on a motorbike, and she was literally swept off her feet by him. Now, war broke out. Agatha ended up doing some nursing classes, and throughout the war, she worked at Torquay Hospital. During Archie's first leave, the couple got married, and they told their families after the event had taken place. So Agatha Miller had become Agatha Christie. So she worked during the war while Archie was away at the Torquay dispensary. And there you can see her as a young woman. And of course, working in a dispensary was very useful experience for somebody who was going to go on and kill as many people as did Agatha Christie, because she learned about different sorts of poisons and how things were kept and what danger they were and how many drops you needed of this or that, how often people took medication. All of this would end up coming out in her novels. Now, Agatha's older sister had once sort of bet her that she couldn't write a murder mystery. She had by this time written a few poems and short stories and even a novel that had been turned down. But her sister, making this bet with her, sort of got her energy up, and she said, oh, well, I think I could do it. And so she ended up writing her first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, or her first detective novel. Now, her detective was derived from an acquaintance with a group of Belgian refugees who had recently arrived in her parish. And later she would greatly come to regret that she had made Hercule Poirot a Belgian, because she knew very, very little about Belgians. And she felt it was a complete pain in the neck that this man she had created on the spur of the moment happened to be a Belgian. She sent her manuscript off to 3 publishers, all of them rejected it, and then one sat on it for a long time, and Agatha virtually forgot about her novel. There was plenty happening with the war and with Archie's home leave, and then the ending of the war, Archie coming home, fortunately unscathed. He was posted to the War Office in London, and the couple took a flat in St. John's Wood. And Agatha would end up having one daughter, her daughter Rosalind, born in the year 1919. Archie was demobilised. He found himself a job in the city. The family moved to West Kensington. They had a nurse, they had a general servant. It was certainly a fairly comfortable sort of life for Agatha. But suddenly, a publisher offered to publish her book. And she later wrote, though I did not know it, Hercule Poirot, my Belgian invention, was hanging round my neck, firmly attached there, like the old man of the sea. She was to become very bored with Poirot. She much preferred her character, Miss Marple. But market forces meant that she just had to keep churning out Poirot novels because the public adored him. So really, she could not abandon him. She could not make the mistake made by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who killed off Sherlock Holmes when he was sick of him and then had to resurrect him from the bottom of the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland. So she kept hoping that Poirot would go into permanent retirement, but she never took the step, much as she longed for it, of turning Poirot into a corpse until, of course, finally that last novel where she kills him off, which was published after her own death. Now, her next book was one called The Secret Adversary, featuring Tommy and Tuppence Beresford. They have never been as popular as her other characters, and it was not one of her better books. The publisher published it rather reluctantly. She wrote a few short stories featuring Poirot, and before too long, she did find herself being referred to as that wonderful writer of detective stories. Now, her career was really just at this very early beginning when suddenly she took a trip to Australia. Now, if you read my book, Brief Encounters, there's a chapter on Agatha Christie and all of the reasons why she came to this country, what she saw here, what she experienced. But the reason for the visit was that a big Empire exhibition was being planned for London in the year 1924. And Archie Christie was asked if he would go on this trip with various other people in the group and sort of drum up interest in the exhibition. So when they came to Australia, their job was really to encourage growers of fruit and producers of new products to send these things off to the Empire exhibition in London, to the Australian Pavilion, where they could all be displayed. So she ended up going along with Archie. She didn't want to miss out. So off she went with Archie on this wonderful world tour, leaving her little daughter Rosalind back in England, being cared for by her sister. And by this time, she was not a particularly famous author, certainly not outside of Britain. One Australian journalist interviewed her. Later, of course, it became very hard to get an interview with Agatha Christie. And she took with her her typewriter on which she was working on her next novel. Now, she wrote a book called The Man with the Brown Suit, and she was offered £500 for that book. And she and Archie were able to buy a house near Sunningdale Golf Course. But here you can see some of the things that were sent to the Empire exhibition from Australia. And a large part of this was due to the work that Archie was doing, but Agatha was sort of part of the team, and she was very involved in the whole experience. And it was very fascinating to discover her reactions to Australia, what she thought about Australian women and how she was inspired by them, how much she loved Australian birds and fruit. So I really enjoyed, when I researched my book, following her travels around Australia. Now, back in England, Agatha found that things were becoming a little difficult in her marriage. Her husband Archie was crazy about golf, and he spent most of the weekend on the golf course. In fact, before Agatha's second marriage to Max Malone, she made him promise before she would agree to marry him that he would never, ever, ever play golf. She came to hate the sport so much, although she did, of course, write a book called Murder on the Links. I think Agatha felt that every golfer ought to be killed off. Now, she became rather lonely while Archie was at playing golf or at work. And before too long, she had a secretary, and she was very busy writing more novels. She would put her work in the hands of an agent. The staff at the agency described her as absolutely terrifying. She was very definite about what she did and didn't want for her new novels. Now, her next book really helped to make her incredibly famous. The plot was actually suggested to her by her brother-in-law, and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was published, and it sold 5,500 copies when suddenly it had the most amazing publicity. Agatha disappeared. Now, she'd undergone a rather traumatic time. Her mother had died, and Archie had told her that he had fallen in love with his secretary, and he wanted a divorce. Agatha refused to divorce him, and laws at that time did not permit him to divorce her. So she knew that she could keep him as her husband so long as she refused that divorce. Now, we don't know exactly what happened in these days. Some of it may be in her autobiographical novel, Unfinished Portrait, which was published in 1934, but this was a time of her life that she really refused to speak about. In December 1926, Archie went to his office and then went off for the weekend with his mistress, Nancy Nile. Agatha had tea with his mother. She went home to dine. She sent a letter to her husband and another to her secretary, asking them to cancel appointments, and then she drove away. The car was found the next day driven into a gravel pit on the Berkshire Downs, with Agatha's things still inside. We know now that Agatha went off to the Harrogate Hotel in Yorkshire, but she registered under a different name. She actually registered under the name of her husband's mistress. She behaved very normally. She even wrote off to a London jeweller, asking that a ring that she had been having fixed would be sent off to Harrogate. But rewards were offered for news of her, and there was enormous publicity about Agatha in the papers. And she even sat in the hotel lounge discussing with other guests the disappearance of the mystery writer Agatha Christie. 7 days after her disappearance, there were 15,000 people searching the Berkshire Downs for any sort of trace of Agatha Christie. And finally, of course, she was recognised and found. Archie came to the Harrogate Hotel to take her home, and she would claim loss of memory. But some of these letters that she sent do seem to contradict that, so it's all very mysterious indeed. However, this did wonderful things for the publicity of the murder of Roger Ackroyd, and it sold in phenomenal numbers. Now, she was a bit miserable, of course, after all of this. And this is a DVD version of a film featuring Vanessa Redgrave and Dustin Hoffman dealing with the whole disappearance. And she seemed, whether she had some sort of breakdown, we don't know. Was she testing out some sort of plot? Was she teaching Archie a lesson? She ended up going off on a holiday, and she also took a train trip, and she ended up writing The Mystery of the Blue Train, which she always said was the worst novel she ever wrote. So it was a difficult time in Agatha's life. But I think that Agatha's trip to Australia had taught her that perhaps women could be more adventurous and independent than the sort of upbringing that she had had. And she ended up going off on archaeological digs, which took her to Egypt and Syria and Iran and Iraq. And it was on one of these digs that she met her archaeologist second husband, Max Mallowan. She herself moved into a flat in Chelsea. Rosalind, her daughter, went away to boarding school. She consented to the divorce with Archie, and she began more and more to travel to different countries where archaeological digs were going on. And before long, Max Mallowan proposed to her. He was 26 and she was 40. He was Catholic and she was Anglican. They got married on the 11th of September 1930 in the city of Edinburgh. And interestingly, both of them falsified their ages on the wedding certificate. Something I think that would have been a lovely detail in the plot of one of her novels. He made himself a bit older, she made herself a little bit younger. Now, Max was beginning to direct his own excavations, and Agatha loved helping. And when she wasn't busy helping with the excavations, she would sit under a little tent or a canopy, and she would continue to write her novels. So by this time, she was trying her hand at what she called her more serious novels under the name of Mary Westmacott. These are pleasant reads, but they're not wonderful novels. And if these were the only books that she had written, I think Agatha Christie would not be remembered today. They were sort of in the same simplistic, unadorned style as the detective novels, but they don't have the wonder of the plotting, which is what makes the detective novels so fabulous. Max tended never to read fiction. He wrote books and articles while Agatha wrote her novels. He did dutifully read her stories, and she would work out her plots by talking aloud to herself and munching on apples, like her character, Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, who goes through a lot of apples in the course of the novels. She loved crosswords, she loved bridge. I think had she lived in the age of Sudoku, she'd have been a fiendish Sudoku solver. And she said working out the plot was her favourite part. Writing the book was the hardest part. Now, another thing that Agatha adored was decorating houses and moving house. She ended up owning quite a few different houses in the course of her life. They had a home in Kensington and they had 2 country houses, always with plenty of servants, and they lived in comfort. So the writing of detective novels was bringing in a nice amount of money. During World War II, Max was in the Home Guard, and Agatha ended up going back to the dispensary in Torquay to update her skills when it came to poisonings. Now, this is their home Greenway in Devon, not too far from Torquay. It is today a National Trust property. Agatha absolutely adored it. And a friend of hers from Australia was actually the architect involved. It's a Georgian house, so not in the construction of the house, but in the renovations that Agatha wanted. So you can visit Greenway today, and it is a truly fabulous place to go and visit. Now, she ended up having 1 grandson, and this is her grandson, Matthew Pritchard. Her daughter Rosalind got married early in the war, but her husband was killed in the war. So she had the 1 son called Matthew, and on one occasion it was coming up to Matthew's birthday, and Agatha thought it might be rather nice to give Matthew the rights to the play that she had just written. It might bring him in a little bit of pocket money. That play, of course, was The Mousetrap, and it kept Matthew Pritchard in comfort for the rest of his life. So during the war, Agatha was prolific. She wrote her own favourite amongst her books, Absent in the Spring, under the Mary Westmacott name. She wrote that book in 3 days. I mean, how did she do it? It takes me years to write a book, but there she was just churning it out in 3 days. and her plays were very popular during the war years. The first one was Black Coffee. She turned many of her own books into plays, and of course, The Mousetrap ended up being the most famous of all of those. She also, of course, within her fiction, created Miss Jane Marple. And here you can see some of the actresses: Margaret Rutherford down at the bottom, Joan Hickson on the left, who for me is definitely the best Miss Marple, and Geraldine McEwen, who has also acted in some of the Miss Marple versions. Agatha began her autobiography, which she finally finished at the age of 75. And The Mousetrap, which she thought might run for a few weeks in London theatres, went on and on and on. And it is, of course, in the Guinness Book of Records as the longest lasting play ever in all of history. So she continued to produce a novel a year in time for Christmas, and everyone would wait for the next Agatha Christie and would be longing to buy it as a nice gift for all of their friends. Generally, the quality of the books is remarkably even. Murder on the Orient Express is a particularly famous one. I'm quite fond of Sparkling Cyanide. I must say I do generally prefer the Poirot ones, but I'm also fond of Miss Marple. As I say, the quality of these books is remarkably even. Now, from time to time, she gained more and more different honours. She received a CBE and a DBE and honorary degrees, and she also ended up going to have dinner at Buckingham Palace with the Queen, who I believe was a very keen Agatha Christie reader. So many, many honours in the later years of her life. And pretty much until the end, the sharpness of that brain and the desire to create amazing puzzles continued right up until the end. Agatha Christie ended up dying at the age of 85 on the 12th of January 1976. Her health in those last years was poor, and her husband Max said that death came as a merciful release at the end. And there you can see Agatha Christie in her later years. And there is her grave in an English country churchyard. She had another house, not Greenway, but another country house, Wallingford, I think, if I remember the name correctly. And she was buried in a churchyard near to that country home. So it's one literary grave I have not yet visited, but when travel all starts up again and I can manage to get to England, it is one place that I would love to go to. So a truly remarkable woman who left a legacy that has really not been equalled by anybody else. It's little wonder that she became known as the Queen of Crime. So Death on the Nile, this fabulous book set on a cruise boat that goes along the Nile, stops at various important historic sites where some of the characters have near-death experiences. And of course, by the time the boat reaches its destination, there are 3 corpses on board. But fortunately, one of the people on board is Hercule Poirot, and we know that Poirot is going to solve the mystery. So the novel was first published in 1937 by Collins Crime Club, and it was published the following year in the United States. To buy a first edition of Death on the Nile was going to cost you 7 shillings and 6pence in the UK. When the book came out, most reviews were very positive. They said it had a very neat plot, it was well constructed, although some complained that it had a slightly over-complex solution. Not every critic was complimentary. Critic Edmund Wilson said, "The writing is of such mawkishness and banality, which seems to me literally impossible to read. You cannot read such a book. You run through it to see the problem worked out." Well, I disagree with Edmund Wilson. I lent the book to my son the other day, and he brought it back the next day, and he said he had read the whole book and absolutely loved it. His first Agatha Christie, I think he will be going on to read more. He loved the puzzle, he loved the characters, he loved the setting. Now, there were some complaints that Agatha didn't make enough use of local colour. But again, I think that is wrong. I think she makes wonderful use of the fact that they're in Egypt. They're stopping off at these amazing historical structures, places like Abu Simbel. And I think she uses the local setting very well. I have twice cruised down the Nile. It's been a wonderful experience. I can't recommend it too highly. And of course, as I cruised, there were no corpses on my ship, fortunately, but one can't help but think of Agatha Christie when making that journey. One critic, Robert Barnard, ranked this book as being amongst Agatha Christie's top 10 books. So you might like to give some thought to which you would feel were in her top 10. It's a book with the classic mystery ingredients, a fairly contained setting. People cannot easily get on or off the boat. There are lots of jealousies, and there are lovers, and there's a sort of love triangle between Jacqueline, Lynette, and Simon. Somebody gets involved in blackmail. There are financial shenanigans going on. There's an heiress with loads and loads of money. There's somebody who's a bit of a kleptomaniac and steals pearls. There's an aristocrat. There's embezzling of trust funds. There's a communist. There are all these different characters put into the mix. And of course, we know that most of them have reasons for having bumped off a character at the beginning. Agatha Christie learned from Arthur Conan Doyle that when you create a wonderful detective, it's a great idea to have a sidekick. Sherlock Holmes, of course, has Dr. Watson, a very nice, intelligent man. He's a doctor, but he's always a couple of steps behind Sherlock Holmes. And we get that with Poirot as well. In some of the novels, we have Colonel Hastings, but in this one, we have his old friend, Colonel Race, who is helping to sort of solve the problem with him, but of course is nowhere near as clever as Poirot. The novel has been translated into many different languages, so you can see here covers in French, in German, in Spanish, and whatever that one is at the bottom, you'll have to work that out for yourself. Is it Japanese or Chinese? I'm sorry, I'm not sure. Now, the major character, of course, is Hercule Poirot, and here we see Peter Ustinov, who I think did a fabulous job in the part. And perhaps in some ways he was a sort of caricature figure when Agatha Christie first created him, but he did become very real to her. And his various little eccentricities, the vanities with the moustache, the insistence that he is Belgian and not French, all of these things become very much familiar to readers of the Poirot novels. She herself would, Agatha Christie would put herself into some of the novels with Poirot as a character called Mrs. Ariadne Oliver. Now, Mrs. Oliver does not appear in Death on the Nile. She's back home in England, but she and Poirot do get involved in various murder mysteries together. And Mrs. Oliver, and you can just see Agatha's frustrations coming out here, writes murder mystery novels. And she has created a hero called Sven Hjersen, who is Finnish and a vegetarian. And on one occasion in the novels, Mrs. Oliver is asked why she made her character a man from Finland and also somebody who doesn't eat meat. And I think you can sense Agatha's frustration with Poirot coming through in this statement from Mrs. Oliver. "How do I know," said Mrs. Oliver crossly, "how do I know why I ever thought of the revolting man? I must have been mad. Why a Finn when I know nothing about Finland? Why all the idiotic mannerisms he's got? These things just happen. You try something and people seem to like it. And then you go on, and before you know where you are, you've got someone like that maddening Sven Hjersen tied to you for life. And people even write and say how fond you must be of him. Fond of him? If I ever met that bony, gangling, vegetable-eating Finn in real life, I'd do a better murder than any I've ever invented." So that comes from the novel Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And I think it sums up what Agatha came to feel about Hercule Poirot. This is a statue of Poirot in Belgium, so he has been immortalized in many ways around the world. Now, Poirot is something of an alien force. In these very English novels, he is foreign, so sometimes his language is a bit odd. He drinks strange things, he's a bit of a dandy, he dresses in odd ways, and he's got that very over-the-top moustache. So the characters that he meets in the course of the novels, and of course most of the characters on the Nile boat are very, very English, and they sort of react to his stage foreignness in the course of the novel. We hear that Poirot has been in active practice as a consultant from the end of World War I right through to 1960. Agatha Christie had real problems with aging Poirot. When she first created him, she had no idea he was going to be so popular and would need to last so long. And I think in the end, she just sort of gave up trying to age him convincingly. Poirot is in many ways the opposite to an active detective. Sherlock Holmes is always rushing around and getting out his magnifying glass and taking trains. Poirot tends to do a lot of sitting. He doesn't crawl about with a magnifying glass looking for clues. He uses those little grey cells. I don't know how much affection he arouses in the average reader. He's never particularly kind. He's not physically attractive, but he does have a remarkable brain. And this is emphasized again and again and again. And here you can see David Suchet in the role. Now, normally I adore David Suchet as Hercule Poirot. I think he is generally the definitive Poirot. However, I didn't feel that his Death on the Nile was as good as the Peter Ustinov one. Maybe it was because I saw the Ustinov one first and loved it. Somehow I felt that David Suchet in this particular one was just not quite as good as he usually is. However, generally, he is the masterful Poirot, and he has done an amazing job in filming all of the novels and the short stories. Frequently, we see him, as I mentioned, with his sidekick, Captain Hastings. He's the sort of Dr. Watson figure. But Agatha Christie got rather sick of Hastings and decided to get rid of him by marrying him off. As I say, never dreaming that he would be so popular, she had trouble with aging him, with giving him a back history. She'd forget what she'd told us about Poirot. On one occasion, he has a limp on one side, and then he gets the limp on the other, and then he loses it altogether. So she rather struggled with sort of keeping up the back history for Poirot. But what Poirot does in the novel is stand for order and tradition and justice being done in the world. And in a world of great confusion and where crooks can get away with all sorts of terrible things, there's something very reassuring about reading an Agatha Christie and knowing that by the end of the novel, order will be restored and justice will be done, and the baddies will be locked away or dead or whatever at the end of the novel. Poirot is not very tall. He's 5'4". We hear he has an egg-shaped head, which he always carries just a little bit to the left, which shows something of a lack of order on Poirot's part. His eyes turn green when he is excited. He wears black patent shoes, and he's always very keen to dust them off with a handkerchief and keep them clean. And he loves twirling his moustaches. And to the horror of most of the English people, he uses a tonic on his hair. Or in other words, he dyes his hair in an era when men certainly did not usually, or English men, did not usually do such a thing. In the early novels, he lives in Faraway Street, but he then moves to Whitehaven Mansion because he likes the geometrical proportions of the buildings. And he has a valet called Georges who shows a quiet efficiency. But the valet, of course, does not come with him on the trip on the Nile. And here we can see, with very large moustaches that have had quite a bit of twirling, Kenneth Branagh in the film that will be coming out. I believe it's being released in December, but I'm not quite certain that we'll get it in Australia quite that quickly. We might have to wait until early next year. And Kenneth Branagh, of course, acted Poirot in Murder on the Orient Express, and so he then decided to move on to Death on the Nile. I love Kenneth Branagh as an actor, but he is not Hercule Poirot in my mind. He's wonderful in Shakespeare and lots of other things, but somehow as Poirot, he comes across as just too stagey. And the moustaches don't look as if they have grown out of Kenneth Branagh's face. They look like they've been glued on with stage glue. And I don't find him a convincing Poirot. But I will certainly go and see the movie and give him a second go and see what I think. Now, Poirot tends to use English as needed. He sometimes tries deliberately to sound especially foreign because he feels that people can be tricked into saying things if a foreigner is around. But he does actually have a very good grasp of English. And in Death on the Nile, he notices Louise Bourget's rather strange phrasing of, had I been out of my cabin and had I seen somebody passing by, and that gets him thinking, and then of course he realizes that the maid is trying to blackmail the murderers. So he uses his foreignness, but he does have a very good grasp of the English language. Some film producers have had trouble with the fact that Poirot is such a cerebral character. He doesn't do lots of rushing around. He tends to just sit. So we see him sitting there on the boat on the Nile, getting things worked out, and he's not doing a lot of moving around or rushing off to interview people here and there. So he is a character who just likes to sit and think about how everything is going. Perhaps Poirot sort of appeals to the child in all of us, and as I said, to our desire for order. He is egotistical, he's quite vain, and he knows he's the world's greatest detective, and he likes other people to know that as well. But I love the way in which he looks at the facts and draws what in the end can be the one and only obvious conclusion. He says in Death on the Nile, it is always the facts that will not fit in that are significant. And so he looks to see what facts don't fit and where he can draw his conclusions. Now, having myself been to Egypt, and I have sat on the balcony here at the Winter Palace with a nice glass of wine one evening, it was a lovely moment, I particularly enjoy the Egyptian setting for Death on the Nile. Simon and Lynette go and honeymoon in Egypt, and we hear that they're visiting some of the important places around the different cities. And the Winter Palace is certainly a building that Agatha Christie knew. She also knew very well and stayed at this building, the Old Cataract Hotel, and that's the Nile River that is flowing past it. So this was a place that she loved to stay, and a place that many famous people stayed at, including Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, Jimmy Carter, Princess Diana, and Agatha Christie. And some of the 1978 film version was actually filmed here at the Old Cataract Hotel. The characters then end up getting on a boat. It's called the Karnak. And they travel on the Karnak. This is a very typical Nile cruiser, to the Temple of Amun. So I think Agatha Christie makes good use of the various Egyptian locations for her novel, and we do get a sense of being in Egypt and cruising down the Nile. Now, Agatha Christie adapted her novel into a stage play. This first opened in the city of Dundee in January 1944. She called it Hidden Horizon. And here you can see a cast, not of that particular stage version. This was a later version, but these are characters acting in a theatrical version of Death on the Nile. It was then featured in the West End as a play as Death on the Nile in the year 1946. In 1950, there was a live television version in the United States. It was a 1-hour play, so they must have had to condense it enormously, featuring the actors Guy Spall and Patricia Wheel, but that version does not seem to have survived. Then in 1978, we get the Peter Ustinov film version. He ended up having 6 appearances as Poirot, and it had a truly star-studded cast. Maggie Smith, David Niven, Mia Farrow, Angela Lansbury, Betty Davis, Olivia Hussey, and the list goes on. The screenplay did make some changes from the book, but it was a phenomenally popular version, and it was on our televisions yet again on Thursday evening. Then in 2004, there was an ITV Poirot version. It was part of a series called Agatha Christie's Poirot with the great David Suchet as Poirot. It starred Emily Blunt, J.J. Field, James Fox, Francis de la Tour, and David Soul. And it was mainly faithful to Agatha Christie's novel. Coming up, as I mentioned, we have the 2020 film version with Kenneth Branagh both directing and acting Poirot. It also has Arnie Hammer, and if you've watched Rebecca in the last few weeks, you will have seen him as Maxim de Winter. It's being released on the 17th of December, but as I said, it may take a bit longer to get to us in Australia. And the novel has also appeared on radio, as a computer game, and as a graphic novel. And I do love this quote. Bear it in mind this evening after you've eaten dinner. The best time to plan a book is while you're doing the dishes. So I will look forward to hearing from all of you in just a few weeks' time when you have, like Agatha Christie, completed a book and you're sending it out to be enjoyed by loads of other people. So that is Agatha Christie and Death on the Nile, and I hope you've all enjoyed learning a little bit more about this remarkable woman. I suspect we will all rush off to see the new Kenneth Branagh film version when it comes out. But somebody emailed me the other day and she said to me, Agatha Christie is my great comfort read. You know, if you're feeling a bit stressed and you're a bit tired, you just want something that's not too demanding intellectually, that will just make you feel quite pleasant and happy, then a good murder mystery by Agatha Christie really does fit the bill. Generally, her books are cozy English murders. One, of course, is a cozy Egyptian murder, but we don't get all het up and distressed when we read her novels. We are challenged by the puzzle. We are satisfied when order is restored at the end, and we can wave goodbye to Poirot as he steps off that Nile boat and goes off to solve another mystery. So thank you for joining me for Agatha Christie and the Death on the Nile in the last of this little mini-series of lectures. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? You can put them through on the chat line or unmute yourself. Or do we have any questions, Cheryl?
Yes, there's been one from Caroline. She says, what are your thoughts on the works of Sophie Hannah and the new Hercule Poirot?
I've only read one, which I quite enjoyed. Has she brought out more than one? I think she has. I'm not an expert. But yes, I quite enjoyed the one that I read. So, you know, it's always interesting to see what other authors do with the characters created by another author. So yes, I must read some more Sophie Hannah.
Nothing else, just a thank you.
Okay. Well, I would just like to mention that I do have plans for next year, and these will be announced in my next newsletter coming out on the 1st of November. I'm planning a series called Tea with a Book Addict. And this will involve taking you traveling via some wonderful, wonderful novels to 12 different places around the world. You can join me for a Zoom lecture round about this time on a Sunday. And each month we will do a different novel, and I'll take you to South Africa, to Australia, to Russia, to Sweden, to Sicily, to France, all sorts of fabulous locations that you may not actually be able to travel to in person for some months to come. We'll discuss the author behind the book, and we'll look at the way in which wonderful authors reflect a sense of place. within their fiction. If the time slot doesn't suit you, or you're going to be away, or whatever the reason might be, you will be sent a link to the lectures, and you will be able to watch the talk at whatever time it suits you to do so, and watch it several times over if that is what you would like to do. So Tea with a Book Addict, all the details will be announced in my next newsletter, and will very soon be up on my website. So you can plan to join me for the whole year. I would absolutely love to have your company for one Zoom lecture a month and take you on a tour around the world through the absolutely wonderful way of novels. So I do hope that many of you might be able to join me for the little venture that I am planning for next year.
I'd like to say, I'd like to say it's one of the best lectures I've heard, and Agatha Christie is one of my favourite authors. I have read every book, and with Poirot, my mum come from Belgium, so he is...
Oh, how lovely. Thank you, Arlette. That's so nice of you. Is Poirot...
So brilliant, but
do you prefer Poirot to Miss Marple?
Beg pardon?
Do you prefer Poirot to Miss Marple?
Of course.
Yeah.
I think he's terrific. But in that film, Peter Ustinov, he was not a bad Poirot, but all the others are no good apart from, of course.
Well, well done on reading all of Agatha Christie. I think probably I've read 60, something like that. I don't think I've read some of the short stories. I've read most of the novels, and I have seen many of the film versions. But there's something so comforting about Agatha Christie. You pick one up, you know it's going to be a certain length, it's going to give you enough of a challenge, but it's not going to distress you or really disturb you. So I can very much agree with your enjoyment of the novels. Thank you for your kind comments about the talk.
Thank you for your lecture. It was absolutely brilliant, because I didn't know that much about Agatha Christie, you know.
Great. Well, join me next year for some more lovely lectures.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Before you go, Susanna, I do have another question. One is it's from Mary Lou. She said, what did you think of John Malkovich's Poirot?
Oh, I didn't like him. I found him too creepy and disturbing. And perhaps that's because I've seen John Malkovich in very nasty roles, and I couldn't make that jump to see him as Poirot. So he was in...
She's saying she agrees with you.
Yeah, was it what's the book that he was in? Oh, I've forgotten now which film version I saw him in, but I didn't like him. I found him too freaky. So, yeah. I'm pleased you agree with me, Mary Lou.
ABC Murders, apparently.
ABC Murders, that was it.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Agatha Christie was very fond of nursery rhymes, so and sort of patterns, so like A, B, and C, Hickory Dickory Dock, you know, things like that. She would often use sort of quotes from nursery rhymes or stories. 1, 2, buckle my shoe. So she liked sort of latching on to something where there was some sort of pattern as a title for her books. And do try at some stage, when we can all get back to beautiful England, to get to Greenway, because it's fascinating. She was a chronic hoarder. She couldn't throw anything out. I think she needed COVID to sort her house out. But she collected little boxes and masses of clothes, and those you feel at Greenway that she's just walked out, because you know all her clothes are hanging there in the wardrobe, all her collections of little boxes. It was an incredibly cluttered house, full of absolutely chock-a-block of things. It spoke so clearly of her personality, and I love visiting a literary home where you feel the author's just popped out to go and see a friend, and you're seeing how they live.
You said it was very wise to marry an archaeologist.
So it is fascinating. Yeah. Yes. And do anyone who is interested can order my book Brief Encounters, which is the book that has the chapter about Agatha Christie. I can post it out to anyone who wants one, and a signed copy if you want that. But writing about Agatha Christie's time in Australia was great fun. And I actually went to stay at a lovely property in Queensland where Agatha Christie spent 2 weeks. And she loved staying there. It was a real sort of R&R experience for her. And she planted a tree. It's a tree called a leopard tree. And so it's still flourishing there today. And I think she was hugely impressed by the young women who worked at the estate. She said, you know, they'd be whipping up a batch of scones, they'd be driving a tractor, they'd be playing the piano at a bush dance. They were so versatile and so energetic. And she thought Australian women were absolutely marvellous. And also in my book, I look at how she uses Australia in her fiction. And Australia, of course, in those days was quite a useful place for sending someone if you wanted them out of the way and not easily contactable. And there is one of her novels that features some characters who say they are Australian and they're villains. And they keep calling out cooey to each other all the time. And they do it so often that Poirot thinks, really? Is that how people talk in Australia? Do they keep calling cooey all the time? And he gets so suspicious that he begins to investigate them. And he finds out in the end that they're not Australian villains, they're South African villains. So it's a rather lovely use of Australia in one of her novels.
God.
Any other questions?
Viv agrees with the previous comment about John Malkovich, where he was very cold. Strangely, Suchet was never cold, despite the rationalism.
Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. Mary Lou again had a different question. Did she change the title of 10 Little Niggers?
Yes, well, wasn't very PC. So it got changed to And Then There Were None.
Right.
And that again is another nursery rhyme, a sort of game, you know, 10 little niggers sitting
Yes.
on a wall. Very non-PC today, so that needed to be changed. Yeah. But I'm delighted that everyone has enjoyed the talk, and I do hope that you will plan to join me for next year's wonderful program of Tea with a Book Addict. And gosh, is it too early to? It's too early to start thinking about Christmas, but I may not be seeing all of you before next year. Although, of course, I am still doing my series of lectures at the Johnston Collection, so you can still join me for those. They're going on now throughout November, once a week. So I've got some lovely lectures coming up with the Johnston Collection in Melbourne, but of course all by Zoom, so anyone can join them. So stay safe and well, everybody. Keep reading. Find comfort in whatever sort of body count or crime novel you most enjoy. But I love a good crime novel. And Agatha Christie is truly the queen of crime. Thanks for joining me. Stay well, stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.